What's up mga kababayan, Yustat Motors here. Dito sa video natin ngayon ay ating panoorin itong nangyayari sa loob ng Tuwadkom mga kababayan. Hindi na nga mapigilan pang magalit no, ni Tatay Digong dito sa loob ng Tuwadkom. No? Paano ba naman kasi tila ang kinakampiyan pa ang mga kriminal no, nitong mga pulpul na kongreso. Habang ang mga pulis na ginagawa lamang ang trabaho, maprotektahan lamang ang mga ordinaryong mamamayan, sila pa ang minamasama. Wala na talaga sa hulog tong mga pinagsasabi ng mga pulpul na kongreso. Pero bago ang lahat mga kababayan, huwag niyo po sana kalimutan mag-like at subscribe para updated ka sa mga uploads ko araw-araw. At yun na nga no mga kababayan, kung kaya naman pati si PRRD hindi maintindihan no ang logic ng mga Tuwadkom. Kung kaya naman hindi ko na patatagalin pa, heto na ang buong video.
Ang akin kasi ganito, ayaw ko ng kriminal. Kung mapatay mo isang kriminal na lumaban, one less headache for humanity. Pag may isang drug into traffic na lumaban, napatay mo, one less headache for society. Ang akin dyan is just the process of elimination and minimizing the danger to society. Pagka marami yan sila, then walang mangyari. Yari mayor ni presidenta, hayaan mo yung mga sindikato dyan na to floor it. Kung hindi matakot yan, patayin mo, wala talaga mangyari rin. Walang mangyari sa syudad mo, walang mangyari sa Pilipinas.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, to the Honorable Chairman, I'd like to ask, in relation to that, your answers and statements given today, were some of them hyperbole or were all of them matter-of-fact frank as you would give in your command conference?
Well, minsan hindi ako nagbibigay talaga ng direkta na ano. I would leave it hanging so that you will have something to think of.
Well, Mr. President,
Wala kasing tao mag-say na ako ang pumatay ni Rizal. I and I alone. Walang gagong tao na ganyan. You play with words. But when you are in government and you are there in the performance of duty to keep your city or to keep your country at least safe sa mga tao against the criminals, you have now the dilemma of whether or not to side with the innocent people and maybe victims or itong mga criminals. I have no second thoughts. Wala akong duda kung saan ako pupunta. Dito ako pupunta sa tao, kaya maganda ang syudad ko. When I became mayor, maganda ang Davao. Yung na-presidente ako, minus-minus ang sindikato. Kasi alam ng mga tao, pinatay ko sila.
Mr. President, thank you for being candid. And you've just mentioned now that sometimes you admitted, even in this proceedings that we have, that you would mention things that are hyperbole. However, Mr. President, I would like to respectfully remind you, to the Honorable Chairman, that you are under oath. And I think the play on words would have to be at a minimum because anything that you say here will be taken at its face value. With that said, Mr. President, I'd like to reiterate that reminder with the rest of my following questions. I hope there would be no hyperbole, and I hope that is made understood.
I welcome any accusations in court in connection with this and other proceedings which I gave the same statement.
Thank you. Mr. President, my next few questions.
Trabaho ko yun.
Yes.
Trabaho ko yun.
My line of questioning will not be accusations. Actually, I will just be asking you about statements that you made earlier to confirm whether or not they were hyperbole and the facts surrounding the same. So with that, I'd be proceeding, Mr. Chairman. Mr. President, earlier, Chairman Dan Fernandez had this question and you affirmed that when you were mayor, you would go around in your motorcycle and you would be looking for trouble, literally looking for these criminals. And you mentioned that sometimes you would find them and you would kill them. Was that hyperbole, Mr. President?
Not necessarily. Yung enkwentro lang. Nakamotor ako, pagbababa ako, magparking ako, tapos lapitan ko sila. Yung iba magtakbo, yung iba hindi. Minsan, may makita ako na magbunot ng baril. Lumalaban. Hindi naman ako masyado praktisado sa barilan, pero alam ko na pag ganun ang sitwasyon, you're in danger of losing your life.
Mr. President, in these times na rumuronda po kayo naka-big bike and you've had these encounters, how many persons have you killed, Mr. President?
Wala akong accounting dyan.
With no hyperbole, Mr. President, would you know?
Wala talaga akong ano. Maybe 3/4, gano'n. Yung direct talaga na encuentro.
Three-fourths of what po, Mr. President?
Again?
You mentioned 3/4 or 3 or 4.
Hindi, ibig sabihin ko. Iba-ibang situation.
But I mean, how many have you killed, Mr. President,
Yan
in
nga,
these situations?
mga 3 or 4, something like that.
3 or 4 incidents. And in these 3 or 4 incidents, Mr. President, were they all fought in flagrante delicto?
Yun,
Meaning they were in commission of the crime?
I would never kill an innocent. Hindi ako gago magbaril ng tao. Sabi mo nakatali, yung extrajudicial killing niya, sabi mo na nakapusas tapos baril. Hindi ka lalaki niya.
Thank you for the clarification.
That's not a job. Huwag na lang yung sabihin nung tanggalin mo na lang yung mayor pati pagka-police mo. Hindi, that's not a job of pagkalalaki ka, hindi mo gawin yan.
So, Mr. Chair, they were caught in flagrante delicto, meaning in the commission of the crime, at you would say na in all these cases, nanlaban po sila, yung 3 or 4. Bumunot po sila ng baril.
Yes. Sa Dumoy.
Mr. President, in these 3 or 4 cases of...
Ang problema lang yan is actually, 6 ba yun ang namatay? 4 lang ang baril. So, ibig sabihin, hindi lahat nakahawak. But the problem is, when the race youth out, ang bala naman hindi talaga namimili. So, if you are concentrated on one space, tapos nagputok ka na, mabuti sana kung isang bagbang. Kung Armalite, Prrd.
So, Mr. President, you're saying in these instances of your vigilante nights na nakabike po kayo, minsan may collateral damage po?
Wala.
None.
Wala.
So, in these 3 or 4 cases that you mentioned na may pinatay po kayo ng laban, were cases filed against you for homicide?
Wala rin.
Isn't it the job of the prosecutor to, if pag may namatay, either homicide or murder, that you would file the case and you would prove your defense in court?
Si Paed ko yung prosecutor, bakit niya ako na ngayon ng laban, tapos ako pa i-prosecute mo?
So, Mr. President, in these instances where you have killed these 3 and 4 people and no cases were filed,
No. No cases were filed.
would you recall the names of these persons that you have killed?
No. You know, why would maybe it's a silly question. Bakit ko alamin kung sino yung gagong na yan? Honorary ang bahala na sila kung establish ng identity. And the police. Not
Correct.
me.
Mr. Chair, just a manifestation. It is deeply disturbing to know that there's a confession of killing here in which the prosecutor did not investigate. There were no cases were filed, not even before the DOJ. I believe this is something that should be brought up to the attention of the DOJ and should be studied for further time. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I'm waiting for that time. I'd be happy. I would be happy to answer any and all. Walang problema yan.
Thank you for that. Mr. President, you also mentioned earlier kay Chairman Dan, and I think to other congressmen, that marami na po kayong police na pinatay. And I would assume that this is in reference to certain malicious or yung mga ninja cops. Would you have a number kung ilan po ito? Without hyperbole, Mr. President, ilan pong police ang pinatay po ninyo?
Hindi ako
Personally?
lang. Hindi lang ako. Yung police, in a raid, something like that. Shoot out.
In a raid, in a shootout.
Hindi yung sabihin mo na confrontation personal na one-on-one.
Mr. President, what was your participation in the raid or shootout? As a mayor, you were there for the police operation?
Yes.
And this is a one-time thing po ba, Mr. President? Or it has happened multiple times?
What?
Maraming beses na po ba ito nangyari?
Hindi.
So it was only one raid in which maraming police ang pinatay. Would you have a date in mind, or is there a name for this incident that you could recall, Mr. President?
What?
About that raid in which may marami po kayong pinatay na police?
Hindi police ang pinatay ko. May ano tayo dito. Tayo nakaiintindihan.
Miscommunication. Okay, Mr. President. Well, I'll just proceed in another
Hindi
question.
ako nagpapatay ng police ko.
Okay.
I would never do that. Well, sa bagay, may mga police na into kidnapping.
Perhaps yun po yun, Mr. President, because I remember the context of the conversation was mga police na scallywag or yung mga ninja cops. And you mentioned that you would not tolerate the same.
Yes.
So in which case, Mr. President, how many of those have you killed? I would assume the 3 to 4 that you mentioned earlier in your vigilante nights were just regular criminals. And iba naman po ang iyong tally for mga police na mga scallywag.
Matanong man ninyo sa Davao, mga 2 or 3.
2 or 3.
involved in kidnapping.
Kidnapping po ito. And these did not...
Paghawak ng pera.
Mr. President,
Lalo na paghawak ng pera patapos i-rape pa yung mga babae. Talagang wala ka ng pag-asa. Huwag na tayong magsabi extra judicial. O pagkatapos ka magnakaw, hawak mo ang pera, i-rape mo ang mga babae. Pag nandyan ako sa dandan, huwag na natin pag-usapan yung extra judicial killing. Patayan talaga yan.
so Mr. President, the story that you're saying now, yung mga police
Tsaka ano pang sense nun mga kababayan, no? Sila na nga ang gumagawa ng katampalasan dito sa loob ng bansa, tapos sila pa ang puprotektahan, sila pa ang didepensahan. Nasaan ang utak nyo, congressman? Kung makatanong kayo dito kay Tatay Digong, tila'y napakasama niya. Ginagawa niya lang naman ang kanyang tungkulin bilang presidente.
Fiscal 1, na 2 or 3. This is one incident in kidnapping. This is the same incident that you relayed earlier, yung mga nag-kidnap dinala sa Cotabato, tapos binalik po, kumain po sa bahay ng mga babae. Is that the same story, Mr. President?
No, that's not one.
Oh, it's a different story.
There was no police involved.
No police involved. So
Or
that's a
if
separate
they were
incident.
policemen, and then they never tried to...
So Mr. President, I will ask again, itong case po nung kidnap and extortion, yung 2 to 3 policemen that you killed, were any cases filed?
Ano po?
Were any cases filed po nung 2 to 3 policemen na pinatay po ninyo involved with kidnapping and extortion?
Yung police na pinatay ko,
Yes.
involved in kidnapping?
Yes.
O, wala ng kaso yan.
No case. And like
Against whom?
against you po for having killed the policeman.
Ako?
Yes, Mr. President.
Bakit? Bakit magupala ng kaso? May kasama akong police rin dyan eh. Hindi naman ako nagpapahiro. I'm not trying to picture myself as a crusader na... Of course, makasama ko yung mga police.
Sorry, Mr. President, perhaps mali po yung terminology. Not filing the case in court, pero any case po yung for investigation
Marami.
by the DOJ. Also meron po.
Marami.
So, going back po, just to clarify, yung vigilante killings of 3 to 4 persons, likewise, meron din pong
Meron
investigation
po,
po with the DOJ. Okay, Mr. Chair. That clarifies it po.
Automatic yan. Meron talaga.
So, filing the investigation meron.
It's the police, but it's the fiscal who will decide.
Yes.
Ang critical stage na is the fiscal.
Yes.
Whether or not there is a crime committed, or if there is a crime or an act committed, whether it is legal or illegal.
Thank you for the clarification, Mr. President.
Illegal, wala yan.
So earlier, yung binanggit po natin na 3 to 4 persons and then 2 to 3 persons of police, what I meant was fiscal po na investigation, not cases filed in court. At meron naman po. Likewise, Mr. President, yung pinatay po ninyo yung kidnapping incident, yung sa Cotabato, tapos bumalik, kumain sa bahay, paglabas, you confronted them, tapos pinatay po ninyo. Likewise, there was a investigation by the fiscal.
Yes.
Yes, and the case was dismissed.
Alam ko, pag pinara sila ng police, yung laod, the owner of that laod thing, it was the laod, police yan, the owner of laod firing range. Yun ang pumasok sa gitna, pinara sila. Tapos paglabas nila, may carbine na, nandito ako sa tabi.
Mr. President, was that SPO4 Jim Tan? Is that SPO4 Jim Tan, yung may-ari ng Laod firing range?
Ang may-ari ng laod is laod.
Sorry, ano po yung full name po niya, Mr. President, if you would recall?
Hindi mo.
So it was just Laod.
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 You can you can easily get it by just phone.
Thank you, Mr. President. Mr. President, moving on with the next question po, no? Just to follow up on the question by Congressman Manuel. In relation to the vetting of the drug matrix, you mentioned po earlier that in the initial drug matrix that you came out, there was no vetting involved. You said it was the job of the police, yet there was a drug matrix that came from your office. Is that correct, Mr. President? If I am not mistaken, during the course of our investigation, there are allegedly 4 versions of your drug matrix.
Hindi ko na makuha yung tanong mo.
Mr. President, I will rephrase. In the interpellation of Congressman Manuel, there was a talk about the drug matrix or yung narco list po ninyo. And you mentioned that it is the job of the police to vet. You do not vet. However, your office came out with its own drug matrix. So if it did not pass through the police, this underwent no vetting process. Is that a fair statement, Mr. President?
Vetting is a job of the law enforcement. It is shared by everybody. NBI, ipapasa yan. It's not only a requirement, it's their duty. Nagpapasahan kami ng information.
But Mr. President, yes, you mentioned that it would be the job of the PNP. So you mentioned now that it is coordinated with you. The PNP would coordinate that information with you.
Yes,
For the
as mayor. Correct.
Mr. President, we're talking about the drug matrix that you released as president, not as mayor. The one that you released upon assumption of your office in 2016.
Yes. What about?
So this was vetted by the PNP. Was PIDEA involved, Mr. President?
I'm confused now. What's the question?
Mr. President, I'll rephrase. Particularly during your presidency, hindi na po nung panahon na kayo ay mayor. When you sat as president, you came out with the drug matrix. Now, I believe part of the interpellation of Congressman Manuel was that there was a question kung vetted po ito. At sabi po ninyo, hindi vetted. But now you're saying vetted naman po siya by the police, not by you. So you confirm po that, Mr. President.
Lahat ng listahan na dumadating sa akin, clear, binabasa ng babayan, ng military, ng police.
And Mr. President, the PIDEA was involved in this initial list.
Oh, pagka-drugs, PDEA talaga dapat.
I believe the drug matrix was used for the identification of yung mga HVT po ninyo, yung high-value targets. So it is involved in drugs. So PIDEA should have been involved.
Yes, it's always the PDEA who would be the agency to give us the information.
Mr. Chairman, through the committee secretariat, may we know if DG Lazo is here with us today?
Yeah, I think we invited DG Lasso. I don't know if he also received the cancellation notice, but I saw him earlier at the ground floor. I just don't know if he's still here in the hall. Is DG Lasso page? Can you please check if DG Lasso is present? One minute suspension. Hearing is resumed.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to direct my question to DG Lazo. DG Lazo, good afternoon po. Could you correct me if I'm wrong, DG Lazo, but as far as PIDEA was concerned in our previous hearings, you mentioned that the drug matrix, when you were trying to trace the origins, dead end po kayo. The initial version, wala po kayong involvement.
Yes, Your Honor.
You mentioned there were 4 versions. Is that correct, DG Lazo?
Three
Three
versions, Your Honor.
versions. And of these 3 versions, how many did PIDEA participate in?
None, Your Honor.
None. So all 3 versions, and maybe know, I believe you had the timeline presented prior. One was 2016. The other was, would you give us a rundown of the dates po, DG Lazo, please?
I do not have. Can I just refer to my?
Of course, please. Through the Honorable Chairman.
If you would allow, Your Honor, we have a PowerPoint presentation for this. We can have it flash, but it will take a few minutes. That's okay with you.
Mr. Through the Honorable Chairman, kung okay lang po, just mentioning of the dates lang po, we don't need the PowerPoint. Yung the date for the first version, the last date for the second version, the last, and the date for the third.
The first list, Your Honor, is December 20 to 21, 2016. The second list came out on September 28, 2017. And the third list, Your Honor, came out on March 22nd, 2018.
Thank you very much, DG Lazo. And to confirm again, no participation on the part of PIDEA for vetting these high-value targets.
None, Your Honor.
Thank you, DG Lazo. Mr. Chairman, I'd like to direct my questions to the former president again. Mr. President, sorry to disturb your eating. But I trust that you heard the testimony of DG Lazo. Ang sabi po niya, hindi po involved yung PIDEA in all 3 versions of the drug matrix that you released. So kung hindi po PIDEA yung nag-vet ng iyong drug matrix, sino po ito? You mentioned earlier, Mr. President, that the PIDEA was involved.
Well, usually it is the PDEA. Yan talaga ang lead agency. But kung i-bypass sila ng mga police agencies, like the NBI or yung lower echelons, down the line to the municipalities, wala na tayong magawa. It's not a mandatory rule that itong PDEA is always to be there.
Mr. President, I hope you'll forgive my confusion kasi po ang sabi po ninyo kanina, involved po yung PDEA. Now you're saying that it's not necessary, not a hard and fast rule that they're involved.
In what particular case are you referring to?
The drug matrix that you presented during your presidency, Mr. President.
I do not remember. You have to remind me of what that matrix is all about.
Well, Mr. President, sige po. Just to
If there
simplify
is
na lang.
an inconsistency or it is incongruous, you tell me what, because that document might have been there. Matagal na akong hindi na presidente.
Mr. President, there's no allegation po of incongruency or any wrong in the drug matrix. We just are particularly interested in the vetting process of this document. We asked earlier kung sino po yung nag-vet. You mentioned it was an amalgamation of various agencies. PDEA just now said and affirmed that they were not involved. So I'll just make it simple, Mr. President. I'd like to ask, who prepared your drug matrix?
In what particular case?
The drug matrix, Mr. President.
No. Ano yan? Case to case yan. In what particular case?
Apologies, Mr. President. I don't understand what you mean particular case. When you sat, you assumed you presented to the media a drug matrix which held all of the HVTs that you had.
Correct, but sabi ko, what particular case? You cannot make a general statement and ask me a general answer.
I think we're only referring to that one drug matrix, Mr. President.
I do not remember of any one matrix. There were so many matrix in my time as president.
Different variations at different times. Different matrices at different times. But I thought this was one continuing list, Mr. President. That nagdadagdag, nagbabawas. Is that not the case, Mr. President? Yung inyong drug matrix? You would have different matrices? Is that what you are telling us now?
Depende sa agency yung lumapit sa akin. It could be the CIS, it could be the NBI. Lahat ng law enforcement. It could be the Customs Police. Kung may matrix sila. It's not one or two or three. It's a plenty.
So at the time of your presidency, you were presenting different matrices from different agencies. You
Yes.
did not have one master matrix.
Yeah.
Did you not use one master matrix for the PNP?
There are so many law enforcement agencies. Of course, yung PDEA is the lead agency, but they don't have a monopoly of making an arrest or an operation to go after the criminals. Ganon rin ang CIS or walang specific standard.
Mr. President,
Kung sino lang makauna sa kanila.
Mr. President, if there are multiple matrices, how did you decide which one to read before your press cons? If I understand correctly, there should at least be one master list of the matrices. In fact, I remember one press con in which you mentioned the
Talk slower
Mayor
because
Mabilo.
I cannot understand you.
Oh, sorry.
Frankly, you're a lawyer?
Yes, Mr. President. I will talk slower.
Panyero, you talk slower.
Okay. Mr.
Maybe maganda ka ang English mo, pero fortunately, hindi na iintindihan.
Thank you, Mr. President. I will slow down. So, Mr. President,
You are slurring your words. Yeah.
Mr.
I will
President,
follow. If that answer the question that you're answering, then maybe I could hear you right. Ganon ang dating sa akin.
Mr. President, ang sabi po ninyo, you have multiple matrices from different agencies. However, when you conduct your press cons, you present them as one master list. Sometimes you would read from that master list the list of names. And I remember in particular, you had one press con in which you read the name of Mayor Jed Mabilog.
Yes.
So if you have one master list, which matrix is that, Mr. President, and who vets the master list?
That master list was there when I assumed the presidency. Kaya nung na-presidente ako, lumayas yan. Kasi alam niya, papatayin ko siya. Kaya bumalik. Ngayon na lang.
So, Mr. President,
Pero hindi na ako presidente, hindi ko na magpatay. Buwang.
Mr. President, there was one master list then at the time of your assumption. Yet there was updating through various agencies. Who was the agency in charge for